The clay birds, Jesus' most famous apocryphal story. Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. Today we're diving into one of the most fascinating stories about Jesus that you've probably never heard in church. This tale comes from ancient texts that didn't make it into the Bible, and it shows us a very different side of Jesus as a child. So let's get into it. Picture this. It's a sunny Sabbath day in Nazareth, around 2,000 years ago. 5-year-old Jesus is playing by a stream with the other village children. While most kids are throwing stones or splashing in the water, young Jesus is doing something different. He's shaping clay. "Look what I can make," Jesus calls out to the other children, his small hands covered in wet mud from the stream bank. The children gather around, curious to see what Joseph, the carpenter's son, is creating. Jesus carefully molds the clay, his fingers working with unusual precision for such a young child. One by one, 12 perfect little birds take shape. "They're just birds," says one of the older boys dismissively. "My father can carve better ones from wood." But Jesus just smiles. He lines up the clay sparrows along a flat rock, arranging them carefully as if preparing them for something special. Now here's where things get interesting. A man named Annas, son of a local scribe, is walking by the stream. When he sees what Jesus is doing, his face turns red with anger. "You there, Joseph's boy," Annas shouts, hurrying toward the children. "What do you think you're doing?" Young Jesus looks up innocently. "I'm making birds, sir." "On the Sabbath!" Annas is furious now. "You're working on the Sabbath. You're shaping clay. You're creating. This is forbidden." The other children start to back away, frightened by the angry adult. They know breaking Sabbath law is serious business. But Jesus remains calm. "These aren't just clay, sir," Jesus says quietly. "Of course they're clay," Annas nearly shouts. "I can see them right there. Wait until your father hears about this. Wait until I tell the elders." Annas reaches down, ready to destroy the clay birds, to crush them and scatter them as evidence of Jesus' Sabbath violation. But before his hand can reach them, Jesus claps his hands together once, twice, 3 times. "Fly away," the young boy commands. And this is the moment that's been told and retold for nearly 2,000 years. The clay birds, these supposedly lifeless lumps of mud, suddenly tremble. Then, right before everyone's eyes, they transform. Wings that were just molded clay become covered with feathers. Eyes that were simple indentations suddenly gleam with life. "Look, look," the children shout, pointing at the sky. All 12 birds take flight. They circle once above the startled crowd, chirping and singing, their clay transformed into flesh, bone, and feather. Then they scatter in all directions, disappearing into the sky. Annas stands frozen, his mouth hanging open. His hand, which was reaching to destroy the birds, now hangs limply at his side. The other children are cheering and laughing, spinning around trying to follow the birds with their eyes. But that's impossible," Annas stammers. "They were just clay. I saw them. They were just clay." Jesus brushes the remaining mud from his hands into the stream. "I didn't work on the Sabbath, sir," he says matter-of-factly. "I didn't make anything that stayed made. There's no work here anymore, no birds either." By now, other villagers have gathered, drawn by the commotion. Word spreads quickly through the small town. Some people are amazed, others are terrified. A 5-year-old child just brought clay to life. What else might he be capable of? Joseph, Jesus' father, comes running from his carpenter's shop, wood shavings still clinging to his tunic. "What happened? What's all this about?" "Your son," Annas says, still staring at the sky where the birds vanished. "Your son just... those birds?" Mary, Jesus' mother, arrives moments later. When she hears what happened, she doesn't seem surprised exactly, more like resigned. She takes young Jesus by the hand. "Come, child," she says gently. "I think we've had enough playing by the stream for today." But as they walk away, some of the children follow at a distance, begging Jesus to make more animals, to show them more wonders. Jesus just waves goodbye, a mysterious smile on his young face. Now let's pause here and talk about this story. This account comes from a text called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, written probably in the 2nd century, over 100 years after Jesus lived. It's not in the Bible, and for good reason. The early church fathers decided not to include it in the official canon. Why? Well, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas is full of stories like this one, and honestly, some of them make young Jesus seem kind of, well, scary. In some versions, when other children annoy him, he strikes them dead, then brings them back to life. When a teacher tries to discipline him, Jesus lectures the teacher so thoroughly that the man begs Joseph to take his son away. It's a very different portrait from the gentle Jesus of the Gospels, but the clay bird story, this one's different. It's been the most popular and widely repeated tale from these apocryphal texts. Why? Because it shows creativity, not destruction. It shows wonder, not punishment. It shows a young boy with divine power using it to create something beautiful. The story also does something clever. It takes a potential violation of Jewish law and transforms it into something that actually upholds the law. Jesus doesn't technically break the Sabbath because, in the end, there's no work that remains. The birds flew away. Nothing was made. It's almost like a divine loophole. Different versions of this story exist across multiple ancient texts and languages: Greek, Latin, Syriac, Ethiopian, and more. The details change slightly. Sometimes there are 12 birds, sometimes fewer. Sometimes Jesus is 5 years old, sometimes 7, but the core miracle remains the same. Medieval Christians loved this story. Artists painted it. Playwrights dramatized it. Parents told it to their children at bedtime. Even though it wasn't scripture, it captured imaginations in a way that few other apocryphal tales did. The story raises fascinating questions. If Jesus had divine power as a child, why don't the canonical Gospels mention it? The Bible jumps from Jesus as a baby to Jesus as a 12-year-old in the temple, then to his ministry as an adult around age 30. That leaves a lot of years unaccounted for. Some scholars think stories like the clay birds arose because people wanted to fill in those gaps. They wanted to imagine what it was like for Mary and Joseph raising a child who was also somehow divine. How do you discipline God? How do you teach him carpentry when he could probably transform wood with a word? Other scholars see these stories as theological explorations. The clay bird story echoes creation itself. In Genesis, God forms Adam from clay and breathes life into him. Here, young Jesus does something similar, demonstrating his connection to that creative divine power. There's also something deeply human about this story. Every parent knows that children test boundaries. They figure out their abilities through play. This story shows Jesus doing exactly that. He's a kid playing by a stream, experimenting, learning what he can do. The miracle isn't performed to teach a lesson or heal someone. It's almost playful. Of course, modern scholars don't consider the Infancy Gospel of Thomas historically reliable. These stories were written too long after Jesus lived by people who never knew him. They tell us more about what early Christians wondered and imagined than about what actually happened. But here's the thing. Throughout history, stories don't survive for nearly 2,000 years unless they touch something deep in us. The clay bird story has been told and retold, translated and adapted, painted and performed century after century. Why? Maybe because it gives us hope that divine power isn't always about punishment or judgment. Sometimes it's about creation and wonder. Maybe because it reminds us that even God, in human form, was once a child playing by a stream. Maybe because we all wish, just a little bit, that we could clap our hands and watch our creations take flight. The story also speaks to artists and creators throughout the ages. Every artist knows the moment when something lifts off the page, or canvas or stone, when it transcends its material and becomes something more. In that sense, the clay bird story is about every act of creation that touches the divine. So what should we make of this tale? Is it history? Probably not. Is it meaningful? Absolutely. These apocryphal stories exist in a space between history and theology, between fact and meaning. They're not scripture, but they're not worthless either. They're the stories early Christians told each other, the ways they tried to understand the mystery of Jesus. If you walked through the streets of a medieval city, you might have seen the clay bird story carved into cathedral walls. If you visited a Byzantine church, you might have seen it in a mosaic. If you attended a mystery play in a town square, you might have watched child actors recreate that moment when clay became flesh and took flight. Today, the story still appears in books, films, and art from cultures around the world. Islamic tradition actually embraces this story more than modern Christianity does. In the Quran, there's a version of this miracle attributed to Jesus, affirming his prophetic power. If you visited a Byzantine church, you might have seen it in a mosaic. If you attended a mystery play in a town square, you might have watched child actors recreate that moment when clay became flesh and took flight. Today, the story still appears in books, films, and art from cultures around the world. Islamic tradition actually embraces this story more than modern Christianity does. In the Quran, there's a version of this miracle attributed to Jesus, affirming his prophetic power. So the clay birds have flown across religious boundaries too. Here's one more thing to consider. Maybe the story endures because it speaks to transformation itself. Clay to bird, earthly to divine, ordinary to miraculous. Isn't that what the entire Jesus story is about? The divine entering the ordinary world, transforming it, then ascending back to the heavens? Those 12 clay birds, taking flight from a young boy's hands on a Sabbath day by a stream in Nazareth, carrying with them centuries of wonder, debate, artistic inspiration, and the simple human desire to believe that the ordinary can become extraordinary, that creation can take wings. So the next time you see a bird, maybe you'll remember this story. Maybe you'll think about young Jesus by that stream, his hands muddy, his smile mysterious, watching his creations take their first flight into the eternal sky. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this dive into apocryphal Christian literature, hit that like button and subscribe. Next week, we're exploring another story that didn't make it into the Bible, and trust me, it's even wilder than this one. Leave a comment letting me know what other ancient texts you want us to cover. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep your imagination as free as those clay birds taking flight. But wait, before you go, let me tell you about something really fascinating. The clay bird story didn't just inspire religious art and literature. It actually influenced how people thought about childhood divinity and power for centuries. In medieval Europe, there was this whole genre of miracle plays where children would act out this scene. Imagine a town square packed with people and a young actor playing Jesus holding up little clay figures. Then, through stage magic of the time, real doves would be released, flying up into the air while the crowd gasped. These performances were huge events, drawing people from neighboring villages. Did you see the birds fly? One medieval peasant might ask another after the show. Yes, just like the stories say, the boy Christ made them live. These plays did something interesting. They made Jesus relatable to ordinary families. Every parent watching could imagine their own child having extraordinary potential. Every child could imagine being chosen for something special. But here's where it gets even more intriguing. The clay bird story appears in other religious traditions with variations. In some Gnostic texts, the miracle represents Jesus' knowledge of secret divine names and powers. When he speaks the right words, creation itself responds. The name, the secret name, a Gnostic teacher might whisper to his students. That's what Jesus knew. The name that calls life forth from death, spirit from matter. The T In Jewish mystical traditions, there are similar stories about rabbis and sages creating life from clay. The most famous is the golem legend. These stories about animating clay figures might all share common roots in ancient Near Eastern traditions about the power of words and divine names. Some scholars have even suggested that the clay bird story might preserve a memory of something real, not the miracle itself, but perhaps Jesus as a child did play by streams, did make clay figures, and did have an unusual presence even then. Maybe the miracle grew in the telling, the way fishing stories do. Remember when Jesus was little, an elderly villager might have said decades later. Always making things with his hands. Special child he was. You could see it even then. Really? What did you see? A younger person asks. Well, there was this one time. And the story begins, growing with each retelling until clay becomes flesh and earthbound things take wing. The story also raises questions about power and responsibility. If Jesus had these abilities as a child, did Mary and Joseph worry about him? Did they warn him not to show off? Did they fear what might happen if the wrong people found out? Jesus, please, Mary might have said after the incident at the stream. You must be careful. People don't understand. They're afraid of what they don't understand. But Mother, I didn't hurt anyone. I made something beautiful. I know, my son, I know. But beautiful things can frighten people too, especially when they don't know where the beauty comes from. This tension between divine power and human vulnerability runs through all the infancy narratives. Jesus is simultaneously the most powerful being in these stories and the most vulnerable, because he's a child in a world that doesn't yet understand who he is. There's also something poignant about the birds flying away. Jesus creates something perfect and immediately lets it go. He doesn't cage the birds, doesn't keep them as proof of his power, doesn't parade them around the village. He gives them freedom. In that moment, maybe we see the entire arc of the Jesus story, divine power entering the world, transforming it, and then releasing it to go where it will. Where did they go? One of the children watching might have asked. The birds Jesus made? Everywhere, another child might answer. They went everywhere. And maybe they're still flying, carrying his blessing with them. The clay bird's story has inspired countless artists, writers and thinkers over the centuries. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke referenced it. The painter Hieronymus Bosch may have been influenced by it. Modern novelists have reimagined it. The Mexican painter Diego Rivera included a version of it in a mural, showing Jesus as an indigenous child creating birds from earth. Each culture that encountered this story made it their own. In Ethiopian Christianity, the story is told with Jesus making birds from the red clay of East Africa. In Syrian Christianity, it's by the waters of a specific local stream that everyone in the community knows. The story became rooted in the particular while maintaining its universal appeal. And you know what's really interesting? Scientists today can explain a lot about the natural world, about how life actually forms and develops. We know that birds don't spontaneously come from clay. But that hasn't diminished people's fascination with this story, because it was never really about the biology of bird creation. It's about the moment when something becomes more than the sum of its parts, when words become poetry, when sounds become music, when paint becomes art, when clay becomes something that flies. Every creator knows this feeling. You start with raw materials, ordinary things, and through some mysterious process, they transform into something that has its own life, its own flight. Maybe that's why artists throughout history have loved this story. They recognize something true in it, even if it's not literally factual. I shaped it with my hands, a sculptor might say, looking at a finished work. But somewhere in the process, it became something I didn't entirely control. It took on its own life. That's the clay bird story right there. That's the magic it describes, the transformation it celebrates. So here we are, 2,000 years later, still talking about a story that may never have happened, about a miracle that can't be proven, about birds made of clay that flew away and left no trace. Why does it endure? Because it tells us something we need to hear. It tells us that the ordinary can become extraordinary. That children playing in mud by a stream might be doing something profound. That creation is a form of blessing. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let something go, watch it fly, and trust where it will land. The story reminds us that before Jesus was a teacher, a healer, a crucified savior, he was a child. A real child with muddy hands and a mysterious smile, playing by a stream while his mother worried and his father worked, and the world had no idea what was coming. And maybe, just maybe, on one particular Sabbath day in an insignificant village in an occupied territory of the Roman Empire, something impossible happened. Something that a few witnesses tried to describe to their children, who told their children, who wrote it down in texts that survived fire and flood and the passage of empires. Or maybe the miracle isn't what happened by that stream. Maybe the miracle is that we're still telling the story, still imagining those birds taking flight, still believing that transformation is possible, that the divine can touch the ordinary and change everything. Thanks again for sticking with me through this extended exploration. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if this resonated with you. Drop a comment telling me your favorite apocryphal story or what you think really happened by that stream 2,000 years ago. See you in the next video, where we'll dive into even stranger waters. Until then, may your creations take flight.